And now on to data transparency and why this is the key to sustainable future. Our speaker will be Stephen Brobst.
Data can make the world a better place. The earth that we live on is screaming in pain at the human consumption of its resources. But we, the people in this virtual room, can use data science and machine learning in order to help cure that pain. The first step in making that happen is to be able to measure what's going on. We need to collect the data. We need to measure, we need to create transparency so that we understand what is the cost to the environment of what we do. What gets measured gets managed. A very famous quote that I like from a brilliant management scientist from Austria who's passed away, Peter Drucker. We live by this. Collect the data, measure the data, and manage. Now, we've been doing this for a long time when you think about activity-based costing. If you're an airline and you're sophisticated, you understand what is the cost of every passenger, what is the cost of every bag that gets checked in from source to destination, what is the cost of each flight. We know everything. We know the cost in dollars or euros or rubles, but we can apply those same techniques for CO2. What is the cost to the environment? It's an externality. It's not measured in the same way that economic cost is measured in the bottom line of a business, but we need to start thinking in that way. And it doesn't matter your business, you can do this. If you're a retailer, we understand what is the cost of the goods that we sell, what is the cost of stocking the store shelves, what is the cost of shrinkage, what is the cost of checkout. We understand all of these things when we do activity-based costing. We can apply those same techniques across virtually every industry to understand the cost of carbon emissions. We can and we should. We can take these activity-based costing models and we can apply them to better collect the data, measure, and manage the health of our environment. Now, put it into action, we have to create a framework for sustainability. And sustainability is not just about the manufacturing of your product. Of course, that's part of it. We want sustainable manufacturing processes. But we also need to make sure that we understand the use of our products, sustainable consumption. The payment solutions from Sberbank are a good example of that, where you think about how the product is going to be used and create a more sustainable way of consumption without the plastics. Think about your products and how they're going to be used, and think about the impact on the environment. Think about the supply chain of how you get the raw materials into your factories, and how you get the finished goods from your factories to the store shelves and into the consumer's hands. We can measure all of this using activity-based costing models, collecting the data at a detailed level. If you collect the data at a summary level, you will not be able to make good decisions. We need the detailed data. We need the subatomic detail to understand what's really going on in the environment so that we can measure and improve the impact on our business. Now, it gets tougher the further out from your factory that you move. So we can measure the direct emissions in our factory. How much CO2 do we emit during the manufacturing process and so on. And that's, of course, important. We should also be measuring the indirect emissions. In other words, the energy that is being consumed to run our factories. Is that clean energy or is that dirty energy? We measure that as well. But I'm going to challenge us to go further. Challenge us to go to what's referred to as Scope 3, which is understanding the full value chain. Not just the manufacturing and the indirect emissions from the energy, but the supply chain from the extraction of raw materials, the delivery of those raw materials all the way to the factory, and then the delivery of the goods to the consumer and ultimately the consumption of those goods. So we need to start incrementally. We need to start one step at a time. We start with the manufacturing of our product. We start with the next step as the indirect emissions. And then I challenge us, in whatever industry you're in, to think about the complete value chain and start to measure. And once we measure, we can start to manage. And we can start to optimize and reduce the cost of the CO2 emissions. Just like historically, we have reduced the cost of the dollars and rubles and euros that we spend in our manufacturing processes. So now think of CO2 as another cost. My question to you is, how does your company use machine learning? Most companies are using machine learning in order to optimize revenue, to reduce cost, to increase profitability. And these are certainly things that we want to do for our businesses in order to make them economically viable. But I'm going to challenge us, the practitioners in this virtual room, to think differently, to think about how we can add another objective to our machine learning, an objective which includes minimizing the cost to the environment. Machine learning does not have to have a single objective function of maximizing profitability. We can introduce multiple objective functions and create a balance between them, and also think about sustainability. So when we look at this direction that we're headed, if we use the machine learning only for profitability, the direction that we're going is not a good direction. And if we keep going in that direction, we're going to get to a bad place. Lao Tzu, a Taoist master, I think wisely said, if you don't change direction, you may end up where you're headed. And we don't want to be where we're headed right now in terms of the ecological impact of our practices in doing business and consumption in today's world. Because that will take us to ecological disruption. We're already here. We can already see the impact of the ecological disruption, and it's only going to get worse. It means we need to think differently. So we want to define this intersection in the Venn diagram. We have profitable sustainability. That means we care about the environmental sustainability. We also care about economic viability. Now, some people, when I put up this diagram, they say, oh, why are you talking about profitability? We should really be focused on environmental sustainability. This is the big issue. I agree, it's a big issue. But if we create an environmentally sustainable business model, which is not economically viable, all that good that we would have done will be lost because we'll be out of business. It's important that we have economic viability in addition to environmental sustainability. It is not an either or, right? It is and. The power of and is great. The power of or is bad. We don't have to choose between sustainability or profitability. We can have them both if we're smart. We look for that intersection of environmental sustainability and economic viability. But with machine learning, we can expand the breadth of that profitable sustainability. This intersection in the Venn diagram is too small. There are too many businesses that are economically viable but not environmentally sustainable. There are environmentally sustainable businesses that are not economically viable. Either one of those is not going to work. We need both. And with machine learning, we can start to optimize. We can increase the wedge of profitable sustainability. As we include in our objective functions the ability to optimize for both simultaneously, we can find a greater space for doing business in an environmentally sustainable way. Big data technologies, AI, deep learning, and machine learning technologies, these are tools that we have. That the people in this virtual room are masters of these tools. Let's put those tools to good use. Not just the profitability of the bottom line, but in addition, environmental sustainability. Now, in order to maximize our impact, sometimes we have to burn the house down. We have to radically change the way that we do things. If you start from where you are now and you only make incremental changes, then the impact is going to be relatively small, and it's going to take a long time to get to environmental sustainability. I'm going to challenge you. I'm going to anoint you to be chief destruction officers. Destroy the poor practices of how we've been running our businesses in unsustainable ways and rethink how to run the business. Create something better in its place and use data to drive that. Use data to understand where are the opportunities to change our practices, to make something better in its place. This picture is the burning down of the statue that is made all of wood at Burning Man at the end of the week. Burning Man is one of my favorite places to be of the whole year, because in that place there is huge amounts of innovation, and the burning down of the man is symbolic of taking a step back and being ready to do something even bigger and better next year. And I'm going to challenge you to think about doing that for your businesses in an economically viable way and in an environmentally sustainable way. The way to do that, to make big changes, is to think about zero-based transformation as a best practice. Start from a blank piece of paper. Do not be anchored down by the way that we've done business in the past, because many of those practices are obsolete in the world as we now understand it. Take a step back, build frameworks for executing in different ways, and use the data to guide those frameworks, use the data to optimize those frameworks for those simultaneous objectives of economic viability and environmental sustainability. Now, I'm speaking to you broadly about industries of all different kinds, about retailers and airlines and banks and package shipment companies and telecommunications companies. But we also need to be introspective to ourselves. What is the carbon footprint in data and analytics? All this machine learning and deep learning and AI, it consumes resources. It consumes a lot of resources. Kate Crawford wrote a book, Atlas of AI, and she explains in this book how these practices of extracting resources from the earth in unsustainable ways, in some ways, is the fuel for AI. And we need to change some of these processes. We need to be much more efficient in how we execute our machine learning. Now, a number of years ago, when the whole big data phenomena started, there was this phrase that was used that I absolutely hated. People would say, data is the oil of the 21st century. I hate this phrase. Oil is a dirty resource. You burn oil. You pollute the air. You consume the oil, use it once, and it's done. Not good. Data is not this kind of resource. Data is a reusable resource. The more you use data, the better it gets. The quality increases, the value increases, and it creates a way of doing business in a much more insightful way. Data is not the oil of the 21st century. Data is much better than oil. A reusable resource that does not pollute, but we still have to be efficient in how we use the data so that those resources that we do in fact extract in order to process the data are done in an efficient way. Think about the energy sources for your cloud. Think about the consumption of resources when your cloud is not operating. Now, an example of poor use of data analytics is cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies, for example, Bitcoin, consume a huge amount of resources. If Bitcoin was a country and you were to rank Bitcoin as a country among the top energy consumers in the world, it would be in the top 30. Bitcoin uses more energy than the country of Argentina. Right? This is an example of consuming energy and resources in an inefficient way. I'm going to suggest to you that we need to be smarter. We need to think about how we are consuming resources and make our execution of machine learning much more efficient than it is today. I want to be able to look at this young lady, Greta, standing on the steps of Parliament in Sweden, fighting for environmental sustainability, look her in the eye, and suggest to her that we as an industry are doing the best we can to make the world better. We're doing it for her, we're doing it for our children, we're doing it for our grandchildren, we're doing it for ourselves. And we need to be cognizant that throwing infrastructure at a software problem is a bad idea. Because the cloud has seemingly infinite resources does not mean that we should be consuming those resources without understanding the externalities that are imposed by the consumption of those resources. Efficient use of resources is a critical piece of being successful with machine learning. That means that we need to efficiently use the cloud resources, get the value from the data, and not waste those resources. So I'm going to make 3 calls to action. First, collect the data and measure outcomes. We start with collecting data. When we have that data, we want to create transparency. We measure the outcomes, we create transparency, we share the outcomes. If our suppliers aren't transparent with their CO2 emissions, we're not going to be able to understand what is the cost of our products through the whole value chain. We need to share data up and down the value chain in order to create that transparency. That is the only way we will get visibility to Scope 3. The second call to action is create sustainability objectives for your machine learning. Don't think of machine learning as simply a tool to optimize for profitability. Of course, profitability is part of economic viability. I'm all in favor of profitability, but I want profitability that is environmentally sustainable. So create the objectives for your machine learning so that you're optimizing for these 2 constraints simultaneously. Profitable sustainability, not one or the other. The power of and always wins over the power of or. Third, pursue radical change over incremental change. Do not be satisfied with small steps of improvement. We need to make leaps of improvement, not small incremental steps. Yes, of course, you have to start somewhere. I'm not saying you solve the problem all in one fell swoop, but I want you to take a step back. Take the book that describes what you're doing today and rip the pages out. and start with blank sheets of paper. Start with thinking about how we're going to change the way that we run our businesses to make them much more sustainable. And sustainable through the whole value chain, including how our products are consumed, how they're manufactured, how they're delivered to customers, how they're extracted from the environment, and how they're delivered to our factories. We need sustainability through the full value chain, and this is why this transparency and data is very important to drive that. I hope you will join myself as CTO of Teradata organization as a whole, and really the whole community of data scientists, and endeavor to use data for good, use machine learning for good, and drive a much more sustainable business model, which is also economically viable. Thank you very much for spending this time with me this afternoon.
It was really very fantastic. It was very emotional. Thank you. It was nice to listen to it. It was fabulous. Would you be so kind to answer some questions that are coming right now for you from our viewers? Okay, a small Q&A session.
Absolutely.
Right? Okay, thank you. So what are the main directions of AI development for sustainable society is in the future, the nearest future? So the main directions.
I think that there are two main directions which are somewhat orthogonal. One direction is making the algorithms more efficient so that they consume fewer resources. So, in the past, I think there was a lot of focus on how do we get one more fraction of a percent better accuracy in terms of the predictive capability of our AI algorithms and the optimization capabilities and so on. And we didn't necessarily look at what is the cost of computation associated with that extra fraction of accuracy. So now we start to understand that there are some trade-offs there, and be smarter about how we use resources, and also use more efficient algorithms and more efficient platforms. Because there are a lot of platforms out there that weren't designed to use the underlying cloud resources as efficiently as they should be. I know at Teradata we spent a lot of time engineering the underpinnings of the technology to extract the maximum performance out of smaller resources to become more efficient. The second part of the answer to the question is the uses of AI, right? The uses evolving from purely optimizing, better selling and lower cost to now better sustainability. So as we expand the objectives of the AI algorithms, we create better outcomes for the environment. And those two things come together, of course.
Okay, number 2. Openness and transparency of data enhances development of the digital society. But how difficult is it to achieve transparency at the current stage of the social development?
I think the difficulty is different by industry and even by country, because a lot of it's cultural. In some industries, there's much more openness and sharing between suppliers and consumers of the raw materials and so on. And in others, it's very top secret, and they try to hide the data because they don't want to give the buyer more information that gives them more leverage in the negotiating process and so on. So in order to be successful, we need to move to a more collaborative way of doing business. I believe in collaboration across organizational boundaries. And I think we've learned some very powerful things from this whole COVID-19 thing, because during COVID, organizations that used to compete with each other, they start now helping each other for the greater good. And COVID was an immediate crisis that we had to deal with, and it was very extreme. But I would argue that environmental sustainability is also a crisis we have to deal with. And people think it's further away, because COVID was right in our face. Environmental sustainability may be a little bit further out, but it's there and it's coming fast. And so we need to get the same level of cooperation to fight the unsustainable practices we have today. And so that does require culture change. It's not about technology. We can absolutely do it. It's about culture, and it's about government stepping in and taking a hand and, I'll say, removing friction for sharing data, and in some cases mandating the transparency on the data so that we can get visibility, so we can better optimize.
Yeah, okay. How important are ethical issues in the process of moving towards a sustainable society?
I think ethics are an incredible important part of machine learning and AI. And there are many different dimensions of it. I first got into this ethics question with AI related to the bias that I was observing in the recommendation engines for these AI algorithms, where certain populations of people were not getting the same quality recommendations of other people. This has nothing to do with environmental sustainability, but it has to do with ethics. Thinking about the future generations that come after us is an ethical responsibility in my mind. And environmental sustainability is absolutely tied to that, right? If we are selfish and we say, well, I'm going to consume all the resources today because anyway, by the time they're gone, I'll be dead anyway, I don't care. How selfish is this? Right? This kind of person has no ethics. So we need to take a step back. And the problem is that as individuals, you say, no, I would never do that. But these nameless corporations, they sometimes can do that, right? Because they're not held accountable unless we, the consumers, hold them accountable. This is why I think it's great that Sberbank is sponsoring this initiative, because they are holding themselves responsible, and that makes them as a bank more attractive to consumers. And so consumers, we have responsibility to vote with our dollars to those companies that are committed to sustainability. And if they're not committed, I'm not going to give my dollar. So maybe I'm going to save 2 pennies by going over there instead of over here. But to do that, I'm sacrificing the future of my child. I'm not going to do that. Right? So we need to think beyond the immediate gratification and further to the long term.
So 2 main ideas: cooperation and responsibility, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to see you here. Thank you for your presentation once again, and thank you for being here offline.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.